Clara Whitfield signed her name on that contract without reading the last page. Not because she was careless, because she already knew what it said. Every woman in 3 counties knew what it said. Marry the Beaumont heir, collect the payment, bury him before the year was out. She signed anyway. And when Edward Beaumont looked up from across that desk and asked her why she set the pen down and said quietly, "Because no man should die believing no one chose him," that answer frightened him more than anything in 30 years of business. If this story already has a hold on you, you're exactly who it was written for. Subscribe right now, follow every single part to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 had settled over Beaumont Estate like a held breath. The grounds were beautiful, in the way that only deeply unhappy places can be. Roses climbing the iron fence, tall oaks throwing their shadows long across the lawn. Everything green and alive and utterly indifferent to the grief living inside the main house. The estate sat at the edge of Hargrove County, Virginia, the kind of land that made strangers slow their horses just to look. But the people of Hargrove County didn't slow anymore. They kept their eyes forward when they passed the Beaumont gate. They'd learned to do that over the last 3 years. The carriage that turned up the main drive that Tuesday morning carried 1 passenger. She wasn't what the gatekeeper expected. He'd seen 30 women come through that gate over the past 2 years, daughters of merchants' widows from neighboring counties, a few desperate girls from as far as Maryland. Some arrived in nice dresses. Some arrived with their mothers. All of them had left within 48 hours, and not a single one had looked back. This one arrived alone. She carried a single traveling bag and wore a plain muslin dress the color of old cream, and she stepped down from the carriage herself before the driver could offer his hand. She stood in the drive for a moment, looked up at the house, the way a person looks at something they've already decided about, and walked toward the front door without hesitating. The gatekeeper watched her go. Then he went back to his post and said nothing to anyone, because there was nothing useful he could think to say. Her name was Clara Whitfield. She was 24 years old. She'd come from a farm outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and before that she had worked as a seamstress, then a schoolroom assistant, then a caretaker for her younger brother, until he stopped eating and stopped speaking, and stopped entirely on a February morning 2 years ago. She had held his hand through it. She had not looked away. She was not afraid of dying men. That was the thing Edward Beaumont had not understood when he read her application letter. He'd read dozens. Most of them mentioned money in the first paragraph. Clara Whitfield's letter did not mention money at all. It said in a plain, careful hand, "I have sat with grief before. I am not frightened of it. If your son needs someone who will not leave, I can be that person." Edward had read it 3 times. Then he'd written back the same day, which he had never done for any of the others. He met her in his study, a large room at the front of the house that smelled of old leather and tobacco, and something that might have been loneliness. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders with iron gray hair, and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had hardened into something more formidable. He stood when she entered, which surprised her. She hadn't expected courtesy. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Beaumont." She sat without being asked, which surprised him. He looked at her for a long moment, not unkindly, but with the frank assessment of a man who had been deceived before and had learned to look carefully. She met his gaze without flinching. "You understand the arrangement," he said. It wasn't a question. "I understand what you've written," she said. "I'd like to hear it from you directly, if it's the same to you." Something shifted in his expression. He sat down across from her, folded his hands on the desk, and said, "My son Nathaniel is 31 years old. 3 years ago he contracted an illness that damaged his heart. The physicians say he may live 5 years. They say he may live 1. They have been wrong in both directions before, so I have stopped asking them." He paused. "He has not left his rooms in 14 months. He does not eat with the family. He does not receive visitors. He believes himself to be already dead, Miss Whitfield, and he has been acting accordingly." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And what exactly do you want me to do about that?" "I want you to marry him." I know that part. What do you want me to do? Edward Beaumont was not accustomed to being redirected in his own study. He looked at her with something that was not quite irritation and not quite respect, and said carefully, I want you to make him want to live again. And you believe that's something a person can do for another person? I believe, he said, that a man alone in a dark room will convince himself there is no other kind of room. I believe that the presence of another person, the right person, can create doubt in that conviction. And doubt, he said with a weight that suggested he'd arrived at this conclusion through significant personal suffering, is where change begins. Clara looked at him for a moment. You love him very much, she said. Edward's jaw tightened. He is my son. That's not the same thing, but I appreciate the honesty. She reached into her bag and drew out a folded piece of paper, her own copy of the contract terms. The financial arrangement is fair, more than fair, frankly. I won't pretend otherwise. She set it on the desk. But I want to be clear about something before I sign anything. Go ahead. I'm not going to perform happiness for him. I'm not going to pretend things are simpler than they are, or tell him what you want him to hear, or play some kind of gentle fiction to bring him around. I've watched that approach fail. She said it without bitterness, just plainly the way a person states a fact. If I marry your son, I'll be honest with him. Even when that's uncomfortable. Especially when that's uncomfortable. If that's not what you're looking for, I'll save us both the time. Edward Beaumont stared at her. Then he said, 30 women sat in that chair before you. I know. Not one of them said anything remotely like that. I know that too. A silence stretched between them. Outside the windows, a mockingbird called from somewhere in the oak trees, and the summer heat pressed against the glass. Sign the contract, Miss Whitfield, Edward said at last. She signed it. And she didn't read the last page because she already knew what it said, and because the knowing didn't change her answer. A young housemaid named Polly was sent to show Clara to the East Wing, where she'd been given a room adjacent to what the staff carefully referred to as Mr. Nathaniel's quarters. Polly was 16 with quick, nervous eyes, and she chattered as she walked the way people do when they're trying to fill space that silence makes too heavy. He doesn't eat much, Polly said as they moved down the upstairs corridor. Cook sends up a tray twice a day and most of it comes back. He used to love her biscuits, she told me that herself. Said he'd come down to the kitchen when he was a boy and beg for them straight from the pan. She lowered her voice. He doesn't come down anymore. How long since you've seen him? Clara asked. Polly thought about it. Maybe 6 weeks. He came out to the upstairs landing one night. I saw him from the bottom of the stairs. He just stood there looking down, then went back in. She paused. He looked like a ghost of somebody, if I'm being truthful. Was he frightening? No, ma'am, that's the thing. He just looked sad. Very, very sad. Clara was quiet. They stopped outside a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. Polly knocked twice, soft and quick, the way you knock on a door you don't actually expect to open. There was no answer. She looked at Clara with uncertain eyes. I was told to bring you here, she said. I'm not sure he knows you're coming. That's all right, Clara said. You can go on. Polly hesitated, then went. And Clara stood alone in the hallway outside Nathaniel Beaumont's door, in the thick Virginia summer heat with the sound of the mockingbird still drifting up from below. She knocked. Not the soft apologetic knock Polly had used. A real knock. 3 times steady. Nothing. She knocked again. Mr. Beaumont, my name is Clara Whitfield. I arrived this morning. Your father has told me something of your situation, and I'd like to speak with you directly. Silence. I'll wait, she said to the door. I'm in no hurry. She was not in no hurry. She was acutely aware of the awkwardness of standing in a hallway talking to a closed door. But she said it as though she meant it, and she stood there, and she waited. After 6 minutes, she counted, she heard movement inside the room. The slow, deliberate movement of someone who does everything carefully now, who has learned that the body's resources are not to be squandered. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened. Nathaniel Beaumont stood in the doorway, and Clara looked at him, without allowing her face to do anything she didn't intend. He had been, she could see, a very handsome man. The bones of it were still there. Strong jaw, straight nose, dark eyes that would have been described as striking in any company. But 3 years of illness and 14 months of self-imposed confinement had done their work. He was thinner than a man his height should be. His dark hair was longer than fashion, and he hadn't shaved in what looked like several days. He wore no coat, just a shirt and trousers, which in 1817 Virginia was essentially an announcement of a man who had stopped caring what was proper. But his eyes were sharp. Whatever was wrong with his body, his mind had not gone soft. He looked at her with an intelligence that was also, she noticed, deeply wary. "You're the new one," he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected, low, and a little flat, like a man who has stopped using it for anything that matters. "I'm Clara Whitfield," she said. "I imagine that's what you mean. How old are you?" 24. "How old are you?" A brief pause. 31. "You look older." Something moved across his face, not offense exactly, more like surprise at the direction of the conversation. Most women don't open with that. Most women are trying to make a good impression. I'm trying to have an honest conversation which seems more useful. She tilted her head slightly. "May I come in?" "No." "All right." She stayed where she was, which was close enough to the doorway that he couldn't very well close the door without being rude, and she could see that he recognized this. "Then we can talk here." "I don't want to talk." "I know you don't. I'd guess you haven't wanted to talk to anyone in quite some time." She said it gently, without accusation. "But you opened the door, Mr. Beaumont. That was your choice. I didn't pick the lock." He looked at her. She looked back. "My father sent you," he said. "Your father hired me, yes, but I made the decision to come." A distinction she felt was worth making clear. "I wrote the letter. I signed the contract. No one put a gun to my head." Why? The question landed simply, with no performance around it, and she appreciated that. She said, "Because your letter of circumstance, the one your father put in the notices, it described a man who had decided to stop. And I've been near that before. I know what it looks like from outside the door, and I know what it costs to leave it alone." He was very still. "You don't know me." "I know you opened this door." A long silence. The heat of the corridor pressed around them both. Down the hall, a floorboard creaked as someone moved below. "My father told you I was dying," Nathaniel said. Not a question. "He told me your heart was damaged and that the physicians can't say how long." "Yes." "And you still came." "Still came." He searched her face for something, pity or calculation, or the particular desperate brightness of a woman who wanted to be the story of the girl who saved a dying nobleman. He didn't find any of those things. What he found was harder to categorize, and for that reason more unsettling. "I don't need saving," he said. "I want that clear from the start." "Noted," Clara said. "I'm not here to save you." "Then what are you here for?" She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Company, I suppose, if you want it. And if you don't, I'll stay in my room and read and leave you in peace. That's also an option." He stared at her. "That's not—" He stopped. "Not what?" "That's not what the other women said." "What did they say?" He exhaled through his nose. "Things like that they were sure he'd recover. That he had so much to live for. That they'd seen miracles before." A bitterness in his voice, now small but real. "Things that were meant to make me feel better and made me feel considerably worse." "Because they weren't true," Clara said. "Because they were performances. And I have no interest in watching people perform optimism at me." He leaned against the doorframe, which she noted it was the first time he'd shifted his weight, the first moment that wasn't pure, rigid wariness. "I know what I am, Miss Whitfield. I'm a broken-down clock. I may run a while longer, I may not. I am not confused about this." "Good," she said. He blinked. "Good. I prefer clarity to false comfort. So if we're both clear about the situation, we're ahead of where most people start." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you you're going to be fine. I don't know if you're going to be fine. What I know is that you're standing in this doorway right now, and that's something. That's a remarkably low bar." "Maybe, but you cleared it." He looked at her for a long moment. And then unexpectedly, involuntarily, like a sound that escapes before the mind can catch it, he made a sound, short, low, almost inaudible. It took her a half-second to recognize it. He'd laughed. Not fully. Not the laugh of a man who finds something genuinely funny. The laugh of a man who has been caught off guard by something after a very long time of nothing catching him off guard. He seemed to realize what had happened immediately, because his expression closed again like a shutter. "You should know," he said, his voice carefully flat again, "that I'm not going to be a manageable situation. I don't sleep regular hours. I don't eat regular meals. I say things that are unkind without particularly meaning to, and I don't always catch it in time to apologize. I have a doctor who comes on Thursdays, and I tolerate it, and that is the upper limit of my tolerance for being handled." "I understand." "I'm not pleasant company, Miss Whitfield." "I didn't come for pleasant," she said. "I came because I meant what I wrote in that letter. I've got no illusions about this, and I've got no schedule to keep. If you want to talk, I'll talk. If you want quiet, I can do quiet. If you want me to stay out of your hall entirely, I'll do that too." She met his eyes. "But I'm not going anywhere. That part's not negotiable." Something shifted in his face. Not warmth. It was too soon for warmth. But the wariness changed slightly. Like a door that's been locked from the inside, hearing a knock it can't quite dismiss. "Why not?" he said. "Why isn't it negotiable?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, "Because I told your father it wouldn't be, and I keep my word." He held her gaze for another long beat. Then without another word, he stepped back and turned and walked into the room, leaving the door open behind him. She understood what that meant. She walked in. Downstairs in the study, Edward Beaumont heard it. The sound of a door opened and not shut. The sound of two sets of footsteps, not one. Then a voice, low, unhappy, resistant, speaking more than it had spoken in months. His hand went to the surface of his desk and stayed there. Polly came in with a tea tray and stopped when she saw his face. "Mr. Beaumont, are you all right, sir?" He didn't answer right away. He was listening to the sounds from above, the voices, the small friction of a conversation beginning. "Yes," he said at last. "Leave the tray." After Polly left, he sat for a long time in the quiet of his study. Outside, the summer oaks threw their shadows long across the lawn. The mockingbird had stopped singing. The estate was as still as it ever got. But upstairs, something that had not moved in a very long time had moved. He did not let himself feel hope. He had learned in the past 3 years that hope was a dangerous investment. But he allowed himself something smaller than hope, something harder and more careful. He allowed himself to wait. And downstairs, Edward Beaumont waited as the first real conversation his son had consented to in 14 months continued above him, and the summer afternoon slowly burned itself toward evening. And inside that room at the end of the hall, two people who had both known grief sat across from each other and began very carefully the long and fragile work of learning to speak. The first morning, he didn't speak to her at all. Clara came down to the breakfast table at 7, found it empty, ate alone, and spent the rest of the morning reading in the small parlor off the east hallway. She heard him moving above her slow, deliberate footsteps, crossing the floor of his room, stopping, crossing back. She didn't go up. She turned a page and kept reading. Edward Beaumont watched her from the doorway of the parlor for a long moment before she noticed him. "He didn't come down," he said. "I know. You're not concerned." "I'm not surprised," she said, which wasn't quite the same thing. "He spoke to me for nearly an hour yesterday. That's more than he's done in months by your account. People don't change their habits in one afternoon, Mr. Beaumont. They change them in increments." She looked up from her book. "Give him time." Edward looked as though time was the one thing he was perpetually aware of running out of. He said nothing and left. The second morning, Nathaniel appeared at the top of the stairs. Clara was crossing the front hall when she heard him above her. She looked up. He was standing at the landing, one hand on the banister, actually dressed coat and all, with his hair combed back. He looked like a man braced for something unpleasant. "There's coffee," she said. "Cook made biscuits." A pause. "I don't particularly want biscuits." "Then don't eat the biscuits. There's also coffee." Another pause. Then his foot moved to the top step. He came downstairs. He sat at the far end of the table. He drank 2 cups of coffee and ate nothing, and he said very little. But he was there, and the cook, a wide-shouldered woman named Mrs. Hadley, who had worked the Beaumont kitchen for 22 years, stood in the doorway to her kitchen and pressed both hands flat against the doorframe and did not say a word because she was afraid that any word she said might break whatever thin thread had brought him down those stairs. After breakfast, he went back upstairs. But he'd come down. Clara wrote a single line in the small journal she kept. Day 2. He came to the table. By the end of the first week, coming down for coffee was a habit. It wasn't warmth yet. It wasn't even comfort. It was more like 2 people who had independently decided that a particular corner of a room was tolerable, and who found themselves occupying it at the same time each morning. The conversation was sparse and careful. She asked him nothing about his illness, nothing about how he slept, nothing that required him to justify his existence. She talked about ordinary things, something she'd read, something she'd heard Mrs. Hadley arguing about with the delivery boy, some observation about the way the light worked at that particular hour. He listened. Sometimes he said something back, sometimes he didn't, but he kept coming. On the 8th day he said without preamble, "You're not from money." Clara looked up from her cup. "No, is that a problem?" "I didn't say it was a problem. I said it as a fact." "It's a fact," she agreed. "I grew up on a farm outside Lancaster. My father raised wheat and died doing it. My mother took in mending after. I worked a schoolroom for 2 years and helped raise my younger brother." She said all of this plainly without asking for sympathy. "I am thoroughly, completely not from money." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to learn, the one where he was deciding whether to say what he was actually thinking or default to something safer. He seemed to make a choice. "Then why does my father's offer not mean more to you than it apparently does?" he said. "Because I've been watching you for a week, Miss Whitfield, and you don't behave like a woman who's here for the money. I told your father, the money is fair. I'm not pretending otherwise. But it's not why you're here." She set her cup down. "No, it's not." "Then why?" He leaned forward slightly, just slightly, and she saw how much the question cost him, because it was also a different question underneath. Why would anyone stay? She heard it plainly. She answered the one underneath. "Because I know what it looks like," she said, "when someone decides their life is already over before it actually is. And I know what it costs the people who have to stand outside that door." She met his eyes. "I couldn't help the last person I watched do it. I've spent 2 years thinking about what I would have done differently." She paused. "I'm not saying you're him. You're not. But when your father's notice found me, it felt like—" She stopped, looked for the right word. "Like a door I was supposed to walk through." Nathaniel was very still. "Who was he?" he asked. "My brother," she said. "His name was William. He was 20 years old." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms around something real, like the air settling after a window opens. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said. "So am I." He looked down at his coffee. When he looked up again, something in his face had shifted. Some guard had come down a 1/4 inch. Not much. But she noticed. "You should know. He said that my situation is different from your brother's." "I know that. I'm not choosing to be ill. The body is making its own choices." "I know that too," she said. "I also know that the body and the mind make choices together, and that there are things one can do and things one cannot." She tilted her head. I'm not here to tell you what to do, Nathaniel. She used his given name for the first time, and they both noticed, and neither acknowledged it. I'm just here. He picked up his coffee cup. He drank. He didn't answer, but he also didn't leave. Downstairs, Mrs. Hadley told Polly in a whisper, "He stayed an extra 20 minutes this morning. Mark it down in your memory, girl. That matters." Polly said, "How do you know it's her?" Mrs. Hadley said, "Because the other 30 didn't make it past 2 days, and it's been 8. It was the cook who unwittingly introduced the first real friction. On the 9th morning, Mrs. Hadley, emboldened by Nathaniel's continued presence at the table, and clearly operating under the impression that momentum should be pushed, emerged from the kitchen with a full breakfast spread: eggs, biscuits, cold ham, sliced summer fruit, and a pitcher of fresh milk. She set it in front of Nathaniel with the careful pride of a woman who had been saving herself for a moment like this. "Figured you might want something more substantial, Mr. Nathaniel," she said, beaming. Nathaniel looked at the spread. Then he looked at Mrs. Hadley. Then he pushed back his chair and stood up. "I'm not hungry," he said. His voice was controlled, but the edges of it were brittle. "I've told you before. A cup of coffee. Nothing else. Mr. Nathaniel, you've lost so much weight, and if you'd just—" "I said I'm not hungry." He set his napkin on the table. "Thank you, Mrs. Hadley." He walked out. Not fast, but out. Mrs. Hadley stood there with her elaborate breakfast and a stricken expression, and Clara, who had watched all of this from her end of the table, said gently, "He'll come back tomorrow." "I only wanted to—" "I know what you wanted. He knows too. That's part of the problem." She stood and took her coffee with her. "One thing at a time, Mrs. Hadley, just one thing." She found him in the hallway, stopped at the foot of the stairs, one hand on the newel post, not going up, but not coming back either. She came to stand a few feet away, and didn't say anything. After a moment he said, "She means well." "She loves you," Clara said. "That's harder to navigate than cruelty sometimes." He exhaled. "Everyone in this house watches me like I'm a candle in a windstorm. Like if they breathe wrong, I'll go out." "And that makes you feel like a spectacle," he said. "Like something to be managed rather than a person to be spoken to." She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "Would it help if I spoke to her?" He looked at her. "You'd do that." "I'll tell her 1 cup of coffee and nothing else unless you ask, and that the best thing she can do is act as though you're perfectly capable of taking care of yourself." Clara paused. "Which you are, by the way." Something moved across his face. "I'm really not. You made it down 2 flights of stairs and held a conversation for 9 days running. Give yourself some credit." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You are a very strange woman, Miss Whitfield." "I've been told." He went back to breakfast. He didn't eat the ham, but he ate 1 biscuit without seeming to notice he was doing it, and Mrs. Hadley, who had been coached by Clara in the kitchen 20 minutes earlier, acted as though this were entirely unremarkable. Which was the exactly correct response. Clara caught Mrs. Hadley's eye across the room. The cook pressed her lips together hard, the way people do when they're trying not to cry in public. The shift, when it came sideways the way most real things do. It was a Tuesday afternoon just past 2 o'clock, hot enough that even the mockingbirds had gone quiet, and Clara had stationed herself on the shaded side of the upper hallway with her book when she heard it. Piano. Not practiced, not polished. Hesitant the way hands sound when they've been away from something for a long time and are feeling their way back. A few notes, a pause, a few more. The opening bars of something she recognized it as a sonata she'd heard once at a parlor evening in Lancaster, though she couldn't have named the composer. The music came from behind the door at the far end of the hall. Not his bedroom door, the door to the smaller room beyond which Polly had told her had once been where Mr. Nathaniel practiced for hours every day when he was younger. Clara didn't move. She held her book open in her lap, and she listened. He played for 40 minutes. He stopped 3 times, restarted, played through a passage a half-dozen times in succession. There were mistakes and silences that felt like frustration, and then the music would come back again, more determined than before. By the end of the 40 minutes, he was playing something longer, fuller, a real piece with shape and intention, and she sat in the hallway and felt something tighten in her chest that she couldn't have entirely named. When the music stopped, she got up and went downstairs. Polly was in the front hall. Clara said, "Does your employer know he played today?" Polly said, "I'll tell him." "Don't," Clara said. "Not yet. Let it just be a thing that happened, not a milestone, not a reason for anyone to come and say something meaningful about it." She paused. "Just let it be ordinary." Polly looked at her with 17-year-old gravity and said, "You're very smart, Miss Whitfield." "I've made enough mistakes to know what not to do," Clara said. "That's all." Edward Beaumont heard it from his study and did not come out. He sat with his hands flat on his desk and did not move for a long time, and when Polly came down later, he looked at her, and she shook her head slightly, meaning, "Don't say anything," and he nodded once and went back to his papers. The next day, Nathaniel came downstairs with ink on his fingers. Clara noticed and said nothing. He poured his own coffee, sat down, and said, "I've been trying to remember the Clementi." She looked up. "Is it coming back?" "Parts of it. The fingers remember before the mind does. It's strange." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I used to play 3 hours a day, before." "What stopped you?" "I stopped." A simple answer delivered without self-pity. When you decide everything is ending, music feels like mockery, like insisting on joy in a burning house. He was quiet. It felt dishonest. And now, he considered that. Now it feels like... He paused, searching. "I don't know what it feels like now. Something different." He looked up at her. "Were you in the hallway yesterday?" "A beat." "Yes." "How long?" "Most of it." He held her gaze. "You didn't knock. You didn't come in." It wasn't mine to interrupt. Something settled in his expression. Not warmth yet, but something adjacent to it, the look of a man who has been surprised by the correct response and doesn't quite know what to do with it. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it in a way that went considerably past the surface of the words. His cousin arrived on a Thursday without notice, the way his cousin apparently always did. George Harlow Beaumont was 35, handsome in an obvious practiced way, and had the energy of a man who had never once doubted his own welcome anywhere. He came through the front door with 2 bags, a traveling companion he didn't introduce, and a voice loud enough to fill the whole ground floor. "Uncle Edward, I was in Richmond and thought I'd stop. Where's the boy? Is Nathaniel still?" He caught sight of Clara in the parlor doorway and stopped. His eyes moved over her with quick, automatic assessment. "Hello. Who are you?" "Clara Whitfield," she said. "I'm Nathaniel's wife." A silence. George looked at Edward, who had come in from his study. "When did this happen?" 3 weeks ago, Edward said, quietly. George looked back at Clara. His smile returned, but it was different now, recalibrated. She could see him filing her into a category. Poor girl. Paid arrangement. Temporary. He was not trying to hide the calculation. He didn't think he needed to. "Well," George said. "How charming. And is he well enough to receive visitors?" "You can ask him," Clara said. "I'm his family. Then I'm sure he'll be glad to see you." She stepped aside from the doorway and gestured toward the stairs. "His room is at the end of the hall." George went upstairs. Clara listened. She heard the knock. She heard the door open, which she noted Nathaniel still did for very few people. She heard voices muffled the rise and fall of George's easy, sociable tone, and Nathaniel's flatter, more measured responses. After 20 minutes, George came back down. His expression had changed. "He seems better," George said to Edward. "Than I expected." "He is better," Edward said. George's eyes moved to Clara briefly. He didn't say anything else, but she could see the recalibration happening again, more complex this time, less comfortable. A woman he'd filed as temporary was living in a house where things were actually getting better. That didn't fit neatly into any category he'd prepared. After dinner, Nathaniel came down for dinner. Now 3 out of every 5 nights, George sat across from Clara and said amiably, "You must find it quiet here. After all, a young woman your age used to." He paused as if searching for the right phrase. "More active company." "I find it suits me," Clara said. "And when—" He seemed to choose his next words carefully. "When circumstances change, do you have family to return to? In Pennsylvania, wasn't it?" The table was quiet. Polly serving went very still. Nathaniel said from his end of the table, "George." George looked at him. "She's my wife," Nathaniel said, simply, without heat but with an edge underneath that Clara recognized as the first genuinely protective thing she'd heard him say. "Whatever you're trying to say, don't." George smiled easily. "I was only asking." "You were only being unkind," Nathaniel said. "And I imagine you didn't notice, which is usually how it goes with you." He reached for his water glass. "Try the ham. Mrs. Hadley does it well." George laughed it off. But his eyes had changed again, and across the table, Clara kept her expression even, because she understood something that George Harlow Beaumont had not yet worked out, that when a man who has spent 14 months not caring about anything suddenly defends someone, it means something has shifted in him at a level that has nothing to do with dinner conversation. She kept that thought to herself. But she thought about it for a long time afterward. The night George Harlow left, 5 days after arriving, 2 days longer than anyone had wanted, was the night the thunderstorm came in. It arrived late, well past 10, the summer sky opening up suddenly after a close and airless day. Clara was still awake, sitting in the small parlor off the East Hall, with a lamp and a letter she'd been trying to write to her mother for a week. She heard the thunder come in from the west, and she heard a few minutes later footsteps in the hallway above. Then, unexpectedly, the piano. Not hesitant this time. He was playing with intention, filling the house with something that moved against the thunder, rather than hiding from it. She put her letter down. She climbed the stairs. The door to the music room was open. He was sitting at the piano bench with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, and the lamp on the corner table threw long shadows across the wall, and he was playing. Really. Playing the way she imagined he had played before everything happened, with the whole of himself in it. He didn't stop when she appeared in the doorway. He kept playing. But after a moment he said without looking up, "Come in or stay out. Don't hover." She came in. She sat in the chair nearest the door. He played for another several minutes, and she listened, and the rain came harder against the windows, and the thunder rolled, and the music went on underneath it all, like something that couldn't be drowned out. When he stopped, the silence was different from the silence before the music. Fuller, somehow. "Sit here," he said, moving slightly on the bench. She looked at him. "I don't play." "I know that. Sit here anyway." She came and sat on the bench beside him, 6 inches of space between them. He looked at her hands, her plain, working hands, not the hands of a woman raised to drawing rooms and parlor accomplishments. "Here," he said, and he reached over and set her right hand on the keys. Not holding it, just placing it. "That's middle C. Feel it. It's a key. It's the center," he said. "Everything else is relative to it." He reached past her and played it. "That's your anchor. Whatever happens on either side, you come back to that." She looked at their hands on the keys, inches apart. "Why are you teaching me piano? At what time is it? 11 maybe? Does it matter?" "Not particularly," she admitted. He began to show her patiently, without the condescension she might have expected from a man of his education, where a note sat and how a chord was built and what the relationship between them was. He talked about music the way she had never heard anyone talk about anything, with genuine love, the kind that lives underneath frustration and absence and years of silence and is still there when you go back to it. She played a scale badly. He corrected her finger position without comment. She played it again, less badly. "You learn quickly," he said. "I've had good teachers," she said. And then, because it was nearly midnight and there was a thunderstorm, and they had been sitting closer together than they had ever sat. She said what she was actually thinking. "You love this. You love this more than you've let yourself love anything in years." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Then why did you stop?" He didn't answer immediately. His hands moved to the keys and played a few notes. Nothing composed, just something to fill the space while he found the words. "Because the last time I played publicly," he said slowly, "I was who I was. I had a future. I had plans. I was going to do things with this." He pressed a key and let it sustain until it faded. "And then I got sick, and none of those things were going to happen. And playing this..." He paused. "Playing this felt like being reminded of everything I was going to be and wasn't." Clara was quiet. The storm moved over the house. "And now," she said. He looked at the keys for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and they were close enough on the bench that she could see the exact point at which his expression changed, the moment he became aware of the proximity in a way he hadn't been a minute before. His jaw tightened. Clara. Her name in his mouth for the first time. Not Miss Whitfield, just Clara. And the way he said it, careful, almost reluctant, as if the word cost him something, made everything in the room feel suddenly different. She didn't move. She waited. He looked at her for a long beat, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen before. Not wariness. Not the exhausted detachment he wore like armor. Something open. Something that was trying to be honest and afraid of what that honesty might cost. He pulled back. Not far. He just shifted slightly on the bench, putting an inch more space between them, and looked back at the piano. "I shouldn't," he said. Low quiet. "Nathaniel, people like me," he said, and his voice had gone flat again in a way that sounded like something rehearsed, something he'd said to himself before in the dark alone. "People like me destroy hopeful things, without meaning to, just by being what we are." He played a single note and let it die. "I am not..." He stopped. "I am not something that can be invested in. I didn't ask you to be. You're sitting here at midnight in a thunderstorm being taught piano," he said with a half-broken quality to his voice. "And you are looking at me the way people look at things they've started to care about. And that's..." He stood up from the bench, went to stand by the window. "That's not fair to you. And I am not going to be responsible for it." Clara sat at the piano bench and looked at his back, and understood with a clarity that was painful what was actually happening. He wasn't protecting her. He was terrified. Not of hurting her. Of not being worth the hurt. She said, "For what it's worth, the decision about what I invest in is mine." He didn't turn around. "Go to bed, Clara." She went to bed. But she sat at the edge of it for a long time in the dark, with the storm still rolling outside, and the sound of rain against the glass, and she thought about what his face had looked like in the moment before he pulled back. That open, terrified, honest face. The face of a man who had felt something, and had immediately begun punishing himself for feeling it. She had seen that face before. Not on Nathaniel. On William, her brother, 3 weeks before the end. She pressed both hands flat against her knees and breathed and told herself that what she was feeling was compassion. Professional compassion. The response of a woman who had made a promise and intended to keep it. But she knew, sitting there in the dark with the rain coming down and his voice still in her ear, "People like me destroy hopeful things." She knew that wasn't entirely true anymore, and that frightened her. More than she'd expected. More than she was prepared for. Because she had come to this house telling herself she was not going to fall into anything. And somewhere between a cup of coffee and a piano bench, and a man defending her at a dinner table she had. She avoided him for 2 days after the thunderstorm. Not conspicuously, Clara was not the kind of woman who made her avoidance obvious. She came down for coffee at the usual hour. She spoke normally when spoken to. She ate dinner at the table and passed the bread when it was needed, and answered Edward's questions about how she was finding Virginia in the summer with perfectly composed sentences. But she did not go upstairs to the music room, and when she heard the piano start in the evenings, She stayed where she was. Nathaniel noticed. She knew he noticed because on the second evening, the piano stopped mid-phrase and did not start again, and 30 minutes later, she heard his footsteps on the stairs. He came to the parlor doorway and stood there, one shoulder against the frame. "You're avoiding me," he said. "I'm reading," she said. "You've been on the same page for 20 minutes. She looked up. He had caught her and they both knew it, and there was a beat of silence in which they regarded each other with the particular directness of two people who have agreed somewhere along the way not to perform. "I'm not avoiding you," she said. "I'm giving you space. There's a difference." "I don't want space." That surprised her enough that she set the book down. "You made that fairly clear the other night." "I made something clear the other night," he said, and his voice had that careful quality again, the one where he was choosing words like a man picking his way across uncertain ground. "I'm not sure it was what I intended." "What did you intend?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he came the rest of the way into the parlor and sat down across from her, and she noticed that he moved more easily than he had a month ago, still careful, still deliberate, but not labored. Not the movement of a man rationing himself. "I panicked," he said. "If we're being honest. We always try to be. Then honestly I panicked." He folded his hands in his lap, looked at them, then back at her. "I'm not accustomed to feeling something that I can't predict the outcome of. For 3 years, everything in my life has been extremely predictable. I was sick. I was getting worse or getting slightly better depending on the week. I was going to die eventually. There was a kind of..." He paused. "A kind of peace in that, if I'm being truthful. Awful peace, but peace. And now," Clara said quietly. "Now I don't know what's going to happen," he said. "And I don't know how to live in that. I used to. But I've forgotten." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not something I can solve for you, Nathaniel." "I know that. And I'm not going to pretend the other night didn't happen. That's the kind of pretending I told your father I wouldn't do. I know that too." He exhaled. "I'm asking you not to disappear on me. That's all. Whatever the rest of it is, whatever I'm capable of and not capable of, I'm asking you not to go quiet on me. I function considerably worse in silence than I do in difficulty." Clara looked at him. This man who had spent 14 months choosing silence for himself and was now sitting in her parlor, asking her not to give it back to him, and felt something shift in her chest that she did not examine too closely. "I can do that," she said. He nodded. He stayed another hour. They talked about nothing important, and everything important was said underneath it, and when he left he said good night in a tone that was not quite what it had been before the thunderstorm. And that was all right. Some distances close gradually. That's the only way they close at all. 3 weeks passed. They were by any measure the strangest 3 weeks of Clara's life, stranger even than the weeks immediately after William died, because grief at least had a defined shape. What was happening in the Beaumont house had no shape she could name. It was something being made in real time, and the making of it was fragile and terrifying and in certain hours more alive than anything she had felt in 2 years. Nathaniel began walking in the morning. Just the grounds at first, the length of the east garden, and back, which he accomplished with the determination of a man who has decided that if he's going to do something, he's going to do it correctly. Clara walked with him sometimes. Other times she watched from the upstairs window and kept the observation to herself. He started eating more. Not dramatically. Mrs. Hadley, whom Clara had coached thoroughly, did not remark on it. But the trays came back less full, and one Thursday morning Nathaniel came down to breakfast and ate eggs and biscuits and half a bowl of summer berries, and drank 3 cups of coffee, and talked for 40 minutes about a letter he'd received from a former schoolmate in Philadelphia, and Mrs. Hadley in the kitchen had to go stand over the sink for a full minute before she could trust herself to come back out. He played the piano almost every evening now. Sometimes he called for Clara, and sometimes he didn't, and she had learned to read the difference the nights the music was private and the nights it was meant to be shared. When it was meant to be shared, she came and sat and listened, and sometimes he talked between pieces about the composers or the theory or some memory attached to a particular piece, and she listened to all of it with the full attention. That was, she had realized one of the things he responded to most. He told her once on a particularly still evening, "You listen differently than most people." How so? Most people listen while thinking about what they're going to say next. He played a chord. Listen. My mother used to say I was unnaturally quiet for a child, she said. She meant it as a criticism. It's not. I know, she said. I figured that out eventually. He smiled. Not the involuntary short thing that had escaped him in the doorway on the first day. A real smile, deliberate and warm. And it changed his face entirely. Made him look younger and more like the man he'd been. Before, the one you could still see the ghost of in photographs on his father's study wall. She looked away from it, before he could catch her looking. But she thought about it later. She thought about it more than she should have. The letter arrived on a Monday, tucked inside a packet of business correspondence from Richmond and Edward Beaumont, opened it in his study and read it twice, and then set it face down on his desk and sat very still for a long time. It was from his solicitor. A routine accounting letter, the kind that summarized recent transactions and disbursements. The kind a careful man kept for his records. It listed among other items the full financial terms of the arrangement with Clara Whitfield. Edward had not intended for Nathaniel to see it. He had not intended for anyone to see it, except himself. It was business, the ordinary mechanics of a father trying to hold his family together by the most practical means available to him. He put it back in the packet, and locked the packet in his desk drawer, and told himself it was handled. He had not accounted for George. George Harlow Beaumont had left after his visit 3 weeks prior, but he had taken something with him that Edward hadn't noticed, missing a copy of the solicitor's initial terms, which George had lifted from the writing table in the guest room, where they'd been left briefly, because George was the kind of man who always liked to know the numbers. George had not used the information maliciously. He'd mentioned it casually in conversation with 2 business associates in Richmond, because it was an interesting story. His cousin, the dying heir. His father paying a young woman from Pennsylvania an extraordinary sum to come and keep the boy company. A touching arrangement, really. Very Edward. It took 11 days for that conversation to travel from Richmond back to Hargrove County. It arrived in the form of a comment made by a neighboring landowner's wife to Mrs. Hadley at the dry goods store, the way such things always arrive, wrapped in sympathy, lethal at the core. Mrs. Hadley, to her credit, said nothing to anyone except Polly, and only to Polly because Polly was 16 and had overheard and needed to be told not to repeat it. Polly, who was 16 and deeply loyal to Clara and deeply in awe of Nathaniel's tentative recovery and deeply certain that she understood how important it was to keep this from him, told no one, except the stable boy Thomas, because Thomas was 17 and she trusted him completely. Thomas, who had no idea how these things worked, mentioned it to Nathaniel the following morning while helping him saddle the horse he'd begun riding twice a week. He didn't mean to. He'd been trying to say something supportive. He said, "It doesn't matter what people are saying in town, Mr. Nathaniel. Miss Clara isn't here just for the money. Anyone can see she actually—" He stopped, because Nathaniel had gone very still. "What did you say?" Nathaniel said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that is the opposite of calm. Thomas realized what he'd done 3 full seconds too late. "I only meant—" "What money?" Nathaniel said. "Thomas, what money?" Chabot. Clara was in the front hall when she heard him coming down the stairs. She heard it in his footsteps. Not the careful, deliberate pace of a man managing his energy, but something faster and harder. The footsteps of a man who has been hit and is moving before he's finished processing the impact. She turned and looked up. His face stopped her cold. She had seen him in low moods. She had seen him frustrated and withdrawn and closed off. She had not seen this. This was different. This was a man whose face had gone somewhere she didn't have access to. Somewhere past anger, past hurt, into something older and more deeply rooted. Something that had nothing to do with today, and everything to do with 3 years of believing the worst about everything, including himself. "Nathaniel." "How much?" he said. She didn't pretend not to understand. Can we sit down? How much did my father pay you? The front hall was very quiet. Somewhere behind the kitchen door something went silent. Mrs. Hadley. Clara thought, hearing the tone in his voice and going very still. There is a financial arrangement, Clara said. Yes, your father. How much? Nathaniel, I need you to hear me. I am hearing you, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that he immediately controlled, and the controlling of it was worse than the crack. I am hearing you not answer the question, which is an answer. It was part of the agreement, yes, a significant sum. She kept her voice level, kept her eyes on his. I told you on the first day. I told you the financial arrangement was fair. I never pretended otherwise. You told me it wasn't why you were here. It isn't. He laughed. A short, broken, ugly sound, nothing like the laugh in the doorway on that first day. Clara, do you understand? Can you understand how that sounds? That sentence from where I'm standing. Tell me how it sounds. It sounds, he said, exactly like what 30 other women said before they left. He was gripping the banister now, not for physical support, for something to hold on to. It sounds like every kind thing anyone has said to me in 3 years that turned out to be contingent on something I couldn't see. He looked at her, and beneath the anger, his eyes were raw in a way that was almost unbearable to witness. I was worth saving because someone paid you. That's the truth of it. I was a business arrangement that you were kind enough to take seriously. That is not the truth. Then what is? Clara opened her mouth. And then something happened that she had not anticipated and could not entirely explain. Something closed in her suddenly, like a hand closing over a wound. Because the real answer to his question was not about money. The real answer was about William. About a 20-year-old boy who had stopped eating and stopped speaking and stopped entirely while she stood outside his door and told herself she was giving him space. About the specific weight of that failure, which she had been carrying for 2 years and had never set down in front of anyone, because setting it down meant examining it, and examining it meant accepting what it said about her and what she'd done and not done. She was not ready. Standing in the front hall with Nathaniel's raw eyes on her, she was not ready. I can't. She stopped, started again. The reason I came is more complicated than I can explain right now. But it is not money. I swear to you, it is not money. You can't explain it. Not right now, not like this. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him make a decision, not the slow, deliberate decision of a man thinking it through, but the fast, terrible decision of a man whose worst conviction about himself has just been confirmed and who is moving to protect it. Then I have nothing further to say, he said. He walked past her, down the hall, and she heard the door to the music room open and close and the bolt slide home. The house went silent. Edward found her 20 minutes later, still standing in the front hall, and he knew immediately from the quality of the silence what had happened. He found out, Edward said. Yes. Edward closed his eyes briefly. I left papers. I should have been more careful. George must have... He stopped. It didn't matter how. What did he say? What you'd expect. She looked at Edward. He thinks the whole thing was manufactured, that I'm here because of money and the rest was... She pressed her lips together. Performance. It isn't. I know that. Then tell him, I tried. She met Edward's eyes. There are things I need to tell him that I wasn't ready to say, and he didn't give me time, and I don't blame him for that. He's been waiting for proof that the world is exactly as bad as he's decided it is, and right now, I look like that proof. Edward was quiet for a moment. What will you do? Clara looked down the hall at the closed door of the music room, at the thin line of lamplight visible underneath it. What I said I'd do, she said. She walked down the hall. She did not knock. She sat down on the floor outside the music room door, her back against the wall beside it, and she stayed there. No music came. No voice. Just silence from inside and from outside, Clara sitting on the floor of the hallway with her hands in her lap. Edward stood at the end of the hall and watched her and said nothing. After a while he went to his study, and he sat down, and he didn't work and he didn't read. He just sat and listened to the silence from upstairs and waited. An hour passed, then another. Polly crept upstairs at 9 o'clock with a candle and nearly walked into Clara on the floor. She stopped, stared, then sat down beside her. Clara looked at her and shook her head very slightly, meaning, "Don't say anything," and Polly nodded and stayed anyway, sitting beside her in the hallway, like a very young, very worried sentry. After a while Polly whispered, "Is he all right?" "He will be," Clara said. She said it the way people say things that are both uncertain and necessary to say. "Go to bed, Polly." Polly went to bed. Clara stayed. The lamplight under the door shifted. At some point he'd moved the lamp. She heard him once, footsteps crossing the floor, stopping. She heard what might have been a hand placed against the inside of the door, or might have been nothing. She did not knock. She did not call out. She sat. At some point she stopped thinking about what to say and started thinking about William. She hadn't done that in a long time. Not the full memory, not the real version of it, not the part she always redirected away from. William had been 20 years old when he started going quiet. Not the way Nathaniel had gone quiet, not from illness or despair, but from something more diffuse, a kind of graying out, a diminishment of interest in the world that happened so gradually she hadn't caught it until it was advanced. She'd told herself he was tired. She'd told herself he needed space. She'd stood outside his closed door and listened to the silence, and thought, he'll come out when he's ready. I can't push. I need to let him. And she'd been wrong. She had been precisely and catastrophically wrong. He had come out of his room eventually, not the way she'd meant. She'd found him on a February morning when the frost was on the window glass, and she had understood in an instant that all the space she'd given him had not been kindness. It had been its own kind of abandonment. She put her head back against the wall. She had never said that out loud. Not to her mother, not to the pastor who'd come afterward, not to anyone. That she'd made a choice, the choice of space, of patience, of not pushing, and it had cost her brother his life. It had cost William everything. And it had cost her the ability to stand outside a closed door and wait without it meaning something unbearable. But she was here. She was still here, because the one thing she had learned in the 2 years since February was that staying was not the same as fixing. You couldn't fix another person. You couldn't will them back from wherever they'd gone. But you could be present. You could be the body in the hallway, the hand on the other side of the door, the evidence that someone had not left. That was all she had, and she gave it. The clock in the downstairs hall had struck midnight and moved on toward 1 when she heard the bolt slide back. The door opened. Nathaniel stood in the doorway looking down at her on the floor, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He looked terrible, not physically, not more than usual, but in the way that people look when they've spent 2 hours alone with something they'd been trying not to look at directly. "You're on the floor," he said. "I know." "Why?" She looked up at him. "Because you were in there." He stared at her. A long, searching look, the kind that goes past the surface of a person and tries to find out what's underneath. Then he stepped back from the door. She got up off the floor. She went in. The music room was warm from the lamp. He'd been sitting at the piano bench, she could tell from the angle of it, but now he stood by the window, arms crossed, looking out at the dark grounds. "You didn't knock," he said. "No. You didn't say anything. You just sat there." "Yes." A pause. "Why?" She took a breath. "Because that's what I should have done for someone else, 2 years ago." She stopped. Then she did what she hadn't been able to do in the front hall. She said it. "My brother William stopped wanting to be alive, and I stood outside his door and gave him space because I thought that's what he needed, and I was wrong, and I have been wrong about that every day since February." Her voice stayed steady. She had practiced keeping it steady. "That is why I'm here. Not money. Not some professional calling. I'm here because I failed someone I loved, and when your father's letter found me, I saw a door I was supposed to walk through." She met his eyes. "That's the answer I couldn't give you earlier. That's all of it. Nathaniel was very still. You blamed yourself, he said. All this time. Yes. For his death. For the choices I made before it. She paused. I'll probably always blame myself. That's not something that resolves, but I can choose what I do with it. He turned from the window, looked at her across the room. His face was difficult to read. There were too many things moving in it at once. I thought you were performing, he said. Everything. The patience, the not pushing, I thought it was skilled management. Because that's what people do. They manage me. I know. And you're saying it wasn't. I'm saying I've never managed anything successfully in my life, Clara said with a dry plainness that caught him off guard. I'm deeply unqualified to manage anyone. I came here because I needed to, and I stayed because I wanted to. That's all. He sat down heavily on the piano bench, put his elbows on his knees, his face in his hands, and for a moment he was just a man who was very tired and had been holding something very heavy and had just been asked to set it down. My father paid you to come, he said, muffled through his hands. Your father gave me the means to be here. That's different from the reason. Is it? Nathaniel. She crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest the piano. You paid for dinner tonight. Does that mean you were hungry for business reasons? A pause. He looked up from his hands. A look she had not seen on him before, something that was almost amused despite everything, and almost confused and entirely off balance. That's a ridiculous comparison, he said. Maybe. Is it wrong? He said nothing. Looked at the piano keys. I'm not leaving, she said. Not gently, not as a comfort. As a fact. I understand if you're angry. I understand if you need time with this. But I am not leaving, and I need you to know that's a decision I made and not something your father is paying me to say. He sat there for a long time. Outside, the summer night pressed against the windows, and the estate was quiet, and somewhere below the study lamp was still burning, because Edward Beaumont had not been able to bring himself to sleep. William, Nathaniel said at last. Yes. How old was he? 20. And you were 22. She looked at her hands. 2 years older. I thought I knew what he needed. She paused. I've stopped being so sure I know what people need. It's made me more useful, I think, and considerably humbler. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm sorry about your brother. She looked up. He was looking at her with something that was not pity. She was experienced enough with pity to know the difference. It was something that recognized grief and sat with it the way she had tried to sit with his, an equal exchange. Thank you, she said. They sat in the music room for another hour, not playing, not talking much, just occupying the same space in the particular way they developed over weeks. The quiet that was not empty, the silence that meant something. When Clara finally went to bed, she paused at the door. Nathaniel. Still here, he said from the piano bench. I know. She put her hand briefly against the doorframe. Good night. Good night, Clara. She went down the hall to her room. She lay down in the dark, and outside, the mockingbirds had started again in the pre-dawn quiet, and she thought about William, and she thought about Nathaniel, and she thought about the door she'd been standing outside of for 2 years. Not a door in Hargrove County, Virginia, but the one inside herself, the one she'd locked the night she found her brother, and had not opened since. She thought that maybe in the course of staying for someone else, she had accidentally begun the work of staying for herself. She did not know what to do with that yet, but she held it in the dark carefully, like something that might matter. The morning after the music room, Nathaniel came downstairs before Clara did. That had never happened before. She found him already at the table with his coffee, fully dressed, his posture different, not rigid, not braced for impact, but settled in a way she hadn't seen. Mrs. Hadley was hovering near the kitchen door with the expression of a woman witnessing something she doesn't want to jinx by acknowledging. Clara sat down, poured her coffee, said nothing. He said, I want to go to town today. She looked at him over her cup. All right. I haven't been in. He paused, calculating. 14 months. Possibly 15. I know. People will stare. Probably. I don't particularly care, he said. And then, as if testing the truth of that statement, I'm choosing not to care. That's different, but it'll do. Clara set her cup down. Do you want company? He looked at her with a directness that had become over these weeks one of the things she trusted most about him, that he looked at things honestly, including her. Yes, he said. I want you to come. They told Edward at breakfast. Edward set down his fork and stared at his son for a long moment, and said nothing because he was a man who had learned through considerable personal suffering when to stay out of the way of good things. I'll have Thomas bring the carriage, he said. We'll walk, Nathaniel said. It's only 2 miles. Edward stared at him again, said nothing again, picked up his fork. Mrs. Hadley went back into the kitchen, and Polly, who was filling the water pitcher, heard a sound from behind the kitchen door that might have been laughing and might have been crying, and was almost certainly both. The walk to Hargrove took 40 minutes. Nathaniel set the pace deliberate, not hurried, not the careful conservation of a man managing limited resources, but the measured stride of a man who has decided the world is large enough to move through. Clara walked beside him. They talked easily the way they'd learned to talk about small things that contained large things underneath. She said, Are you nervous? Mildly, he admitted. The last time anyone in Hargrove County saw me, I was being carried from a horse. He glanced at her. I was not at my most dignified. Were you conscious? Barely. Then you can't be held accountable for the lack of dignity. I feel accountable anyway. He paused. I've always cared too much what Hargrove County thinks of me. It's a provincial habit I've never fully shed. Is that why you hid? She asked it gently with no accusation. Not entirely, but partly. He considered that. Partly, he said. It's one thing to be ill. It's another to be publicly ill. To have people look at you and see ending. His jaw tightened slightly. I couldn't bear being someone's cautionary tale. And now I reckon I'd rather be a live embarrassment than a dignified corpse, he said with a dryness that made her laugh a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and the sound of it made him glance at her sideways, with something warm and unguarded in his expression. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence. Hargrove was a modest town, a main street, a dry goods store, a blacksmith, a small church with a white steeple, a tavern that pretended to be something more refined than it was. It was a Tuesday morning, and the street was reasonably occupied. Clara felt the exact moment people began to notice. It moved through the street like a current. A woman outside the dry goods store looked up, did a sharp double-take, and leaned to say something to the woman beside her. 2 men talking outside the tavern went quiet. A boy running the opposite direction slowed to stare. Nathaniel felt it. She felt him feel it, a slight tightening in his posture, the almost imperceptible pause between one step and the next. She didn't say anything. She didn't reach for him, didn't try to shield him from it. She just kept walking at exactly the same pace, at exactly the same position at his side, as though the street were empty. After 10 seconds, his posture settled again. A man named Aldridge, the county's largest timber dealer, broad and prosperous and politically connected, came across the street deliberately. He extended his hand. "Nathaniel Beaumont," he said. "Good to see you upright, son." Nathaniel shook his hand. "Mr. Aldridge, you know my wife, Clara." Aldridge looked at Clara with quick assessment and genuine, if awkward, warmth. "I do not, but I'm glad to." He turned back to Nathaniel. "Your father said you'd been under the weather. You're looking—" He stopped himself from whatever platitude was coming. "You look better than I expected." "Better than I expected, too," Nathaniel said, and Aldridge laughed, and something relaxed in the immediate vicinity of all 3 of them. They stayed in town for 2 hours. By the end of the first hour, 6 separate people had come to speak to Nathaniel, and by the end of the second, the double-takes had mostly stopped. He was not a ghost returning. He was a man on a Tuesday in a town he'd grown up in. The street remembered how to hold him. Walking back, Clara said, "Well, well," he agreed. "You survived, apparently." He was quiet for a moment. I forgot what it felt like. To just be somewhere, without it being a performance or an ordeal. He glanced at her. It felt ordinary. I'd forgotten ordinary. "Ordinary is underrated," she said. He looked at her for a long moment as they walked. "You do that," he said. "You make things feel ordinary when they aren't. You have a gift for it." "It's less a gift and more a policy," she said. "Extraordinary things are better approached as if they're ordinary, less chance of frightening them off." He looked at her for another moment with that expression she'd been trying not to catalog, the one that was not quite anything she could name, but that she was beginning to suspect was not entirely manageable on either side. He looked away first. They walked home. But for a half-mile their shoulders were close enough that they occasionally touched, and neither of them moved away. The first person to complicate things was not George this time. It was a man named Preston Walsh, and he arrived 3 days later with a business proposition for Edward and a set of very attentive eyes that he turned repeatedly in Clara's direction. Walsh was 40, unmarried, wealthy from cotton trading, and possessed of the specific self-assurance of a man who has gotten most things he's wanted by a combination of money and persistence. He arrived for dinner on a Thursday, sat across from Clara, and made his interest apparent in the patient, thorough way of a man who doesn't think he needs to hurry. He asked Clara questions. Good questions, actually, about her education, her reading, her opinions on things. He listened to her answers with the particular quality of attention that a woman notices. Nathaniel noticed him noticing. Clara watched Nathaniel from the corner of her eye and saw it, the stillness that came over him, the careful quality that entered his responses when Walsh directed conversation at her. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't even fully conscious. It was the involuntary attention of a man watching something he started to feel proprietary about, and is not yet sure what to do with that feeling. After dinner, Walsh and Edward retired to the study for business. Nathaniel stayed at the table. Clara said, "He seems like a capable man." Walsh, a pause. "He is. He's also an opportunist." "Most capable people are." Nathaniel looked at her. "He was looking at you all through dinner." "I noticed." "Did it bother you?" "No." She tilted her head. "Did it bother you?" A long pause. He picked up his wine glass, looked at it, set it down. "Yes," he said finally, with the particular reluctant honesty of a man who'd promised himself to stop lying about things. "Yes, it bothered me. That's probably not something I have standing to feel, given Nathaniel. Given that I've been fairly clear about what I can and can't." "Nathaniel." She said it more firmly, and he stopped. She leaned forward slightly. "You have standing to feel whatever you feel. Stop court-martialing yourself for it." He looked at her. "You're remarkably difficult to argue with." "I know. It's intentional." She paused. "Mr. Walsh is a perfectly agreeable man. I am not interested in Mr. Walsh." Another pause. "Why not?" "Because," she said simply and plainly, "I'm already somewhere." The silence that followed was the kind that neither of them tried to fill. It sat between them, full and warm and a little terrifying. And then Nathaniel looked down at the table, and when he looked back up, something in his face was different. More honest. More frightened. More present. "Clara," he said. "Still here," she said, using his own words back to him from the night of the music room, and she saw that he recognized them. He reached across the table. His hand covered hers, not grabbing, not reaching, just placing itself there with the careful deliberateness of a man making a decision that cost him something and had decided to make it anyway. She didn't pull back. She turned her hand over, palm up, and his fingers closed around it. They sat like that for a long time. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The second Thursday of October, the doctor came. Dr. Harmon came every week without fail, a gray, methodical man who had been treating Nathaniel since the beginning, and who conducted his examinations with the efficient privacy of a professional who understood that his patient's dignity mattered as much as his data. He emerged from Nathaniel's room on this particular Thursday with a different quality to his expression. Clara was at the top of the stairs when he came out. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted the deliberate neutrality of a man making a choice about what to say. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said. "Dr. Harmon." She kept her voice even. "How is he?" Harmon considered for a moment. "His heart has strengthened," he said carefully. "Marginally but measurably. His color is better. His appetite has improved significantly." A pause. "He has improved. I want to be clear about that. Not recovered, I won't use that word, but improved in ways I did not predict." "But," she said. He looked at her with the respect that honest people give to other honest people. "The improvements are real," he said. "And the underlying condition remains. He will have good months and difficult months. The trajectory appears more favorable than it did 6 months ago. But favorable trajectories can change, Mrs. Beaumont. I don't want anyone building a future on a foundation that hasn't been declared solid." "I understand. Do you—" He looked at her, not unkindly. "Because I've been coming to this house for 3 years, and I've seen what happens when people who care about him allow themselves to—" He stopped. "I'm asking you to be careful. For your own sake." Clara held his gaze. "I appreciate that, Dr. Harmon. I'd ask you to trust that I came here with my eyes open, and they've stayed that way." He nodded, picked up his bag, started down the stairs, then stopped. "He asked me today," the doctor said, not turning around, "whether it was realistic to consider longer-term plans, a family eventually, that kind of thing." A pause. "He hasn't asked me anything like that in 3 years." Another pause. "I thought you ought to know." He went downstairs. Clara stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment, her hand on the banister, very still. Then she heard the door of the music room open behind her. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, looking at her. He'd heard enough. She could tell from his face that he'd heard at least the last part. "I wasn't eavesdropping," she said. "I know." "Dr. Harmon." "I know what Harmon said." He looked at her steadily. "I asked him the question." "I heard." "Did it?" He stopped, started again. "Are you all right?" She almost laughed. "You just had a medical examination, and you're asking if I'm all right. You look like someone who just received information they weren't sure they wanted." "I received information I was glad to have," she said. "It just—" She paused, searching for the honest version. "It made things feel very real. Things I've been letting myself feel without fully examining them." He crossed the hallway. He stood in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his gaze, and she held it. "I'm afraid," he said, straight out, no preamble, no shelter around it. "Not of dying. I want you to understand that I made my peace with dying a long time ago. I'm afraid of living." He watched her face. "Of actually building something and having it matter and then losing it. Of asking you to be inside something that could be taken apart." His voice was low, careful, carrying more weight than the words alone could hold. "That is the thing that terrifies me. Not the end. The middle." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Nathaniel, do you think I don't know that—" I came here knowing your diagnosis," she said. "I held my brother's hand at the end. I know exactly what it looks like when the middle runs out." She held his gaze without flinching. "And I'm standing in this hallway. That is the answer to everything you're afraid of. I am standing here." Something broke open in his expression. Not dramatically. Not the way things break in performances. The way they break in real life, quietly, in the face of something true. He put his hand against the side of her face. She let him. His palm was warm against her cheek, and neither of them moved for a moment, and then she covered his hand with hers, holding it there, and the hallway went very still. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "Neither do I," she said. "We'll work it out." He leaned his forehead down against hers. They stood like that in the October hallway, in the silence of the house, and somewhere downstairs, Edward Beaumont heard the silence from upstairs and recognized with the bone-deep recognition of a man who has hoped for something long enough to know when it's arrived, that it was a different kind of silence now, not empty, full. He played at the Aldridge gathering 2 weeks later. It was not a formal concert, just a small social evening. 12 people, the kind that Hargrove County's minor gentry organized in the autumn, when the harvest was done, and there was briefly time to remember that life had pleasures beyond work. Aldridge had extended the invitation with the careful casualness of a man trying not to make it feel significant. Nathaniel had accepted with the same careful casualness. Clara wore the nicest dress she owned, which was still considerably less grand than the other women's dresses, and she didn't care at all, because Nathaniel had looked at her when she came downstairs and said, "You look exactly like yourself," and she had decided that was the finest compliment she'd ever received. At the Aldridge house, the other guests circled Nathaniel with the particular combination of warmth and awkwardness that people reserve for those they'd privately given up on. There were more than a few who'd attended his near funeral in their minds. Seeing him here upright talking, eating from a plate, it created a social static that no one quite knew how to resolve. Nathaniel resolved it by being exactly himself, not performing recovery, not offering explanation, just present in a room talking about things that mattered to him. Music Politics, a book he'd read last week that he had opinions about. Clara watched from across the room and saw the exact moment people stopped treating him like a visitor from another country and started treating him like a person again. It took about 20 minutes. Aldridge, halfway through the evening, said casually, "Nathaniel, Mrs. Beaumont tells me you've been back at the piano." Nathaniel looked at Clara across the room, with a look that said clearly, "We will discuss your role in this later." She gave him her most composed expression. He sat down at the Aldridge's piano. The room went quiet, in the way that rooms go quiet when something is about to happen that people sense matters. He played for 15 minutes. Not everything he was capable of, the full capability was still returning, still being rebuilt week by week. But enough. More than enough. He played with a wholeness that hadn't been there the first halting evening in the music room, and every person in that parlor felt it, the difference between sound and music, between fingers on keys and a person speaking. When he finished, the silence lasted 3 full seconds before anyone moved. Then Aldridge started clapping and everyone followed, and a woman near the fireplace pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. And across the room, Clara stood very still, with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on Nathaniel, and felt something so large move through her that she had no useful name for it. He found her in the crowd afterward, came straight to her through the people congratulating him, and stood in front of her and said low enough that only she could hear, "You told Aldridge." "I suggested he ask," she said. "You can be angry about it." "I'm not angry." "Good." He stopped. It was another stop. He was not, she had learned, a man who struggled for words generally. When words failed him, it was because the thing was larger than words were designed to carry. "I know," she said. "You always say that. Because you always make it very clear." He looked at her for a moment in the warm noise of the Aldridge parlor, with a dozen people moving around them, and he said, "Thank you for the push." "You did it," she said. "I just opened the door." He reached for her hand in the middle of the room, not hidden, not careful about who saw, and held it. In 1817, Virginia, in a room full of the county's attentive eyes, that was a declaration. Not an accident. A choice. Several people noticed. Several people pretended not to. Mrs. Walsh, who'd come with her brother Preston, noticed most specifically and said something quiet to the woman beside her. Clara didn't care. She held his hand back. They were home by 9, and Edward met them in the front hall, and one look at his son's face told him everything. He said nothing, just nodded once the way a man nods when something he's been waiting for has finally come through, and went back to his study. But Clara caught something in the movement that stopped her. Something in the way Edward walked back to his study. A heaviness she hadn't noticed before. Not the deliberate slowness of a man being careful, but the effortful slowness of a man who was not feeling well and was not saying so. She watched him go. Filed it. That night, after Nathaniel had gone to the music room and she'd heard the piano start full and confident, something she didn't recognize, something she thought might be his own, she went to the kitchen where Mrs. Hadley was cleaning up. "Mrs. Hadley," she said. The cook looked up. "Mr. Beaumont," Clara said. "Edward, how long?" Mrs. Hadley's hands went still on the pot she was drying. She didn't pretend not to understand. "He told me 2 months ago," she said. His heart. "The physician came a Thursday when Dr. Harmon wasn't here. I wasn't supposed to know. I overheard." Clara absorbed that. "Does Nathaniel know?" "No." Mrs. Hadley set down the pot. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "Mr. Edward didn't want him to know. Said the boy had enough to carry," Clara finished. "Yes, ma'am." Clara looked at the kitchen doorway for a moment, thinking. Above her, the piano continued warm, alive, fuller than she'd heard it yet. Nathaniel in the music room playing the way a man plays when he's remembered what it means to be alive. And below his father, who had spent 3 years engineering the conditions for exactly this moment, carrying a weight of his own in deliberate silence. She pressed her hand flat against the kitchen table. "All right," she said. "All right." She left the kitchen. She climbed the stairs. She did not go to the music room. She went to the door of Edward Beaumont's study, which was still lit, and she knocked. "Come in," he said. She came in. She sat across from him the way she had on the very first day without asking, and she looked at him the way she looked at things she'd already decided about. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in the careful infrastructure of Edward Beaumont's self-containment built over decades of Southern propriety and the specific loneliness of powerful men shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. "His heart," Edward said. "Mine, as it turns out, is also making its own choices." He said it with the flat brevity of a man who has had time to accept information and has chosen not to perform anything around it. "The physician gives me 6 months to a year. I've had a month of that already." "And you haven't told Nathaniel?" "He was just beginning to come back," Edward said. "If I told him 5 months ago, he would have—" He stopped. He would have climbed back inside that room and called it grief and used it as permission to stop. His jaw tightened. "I will not be used as his reason to stop." "He's stronger now," Clara said. "I know." "He needs to know, Edward." The use of his given name the first time made something move across his face. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, one that was complicated and full and entirely human. Not the patriarch. The father. "I know that too," he said. They looked at each other in the lamplight of his study, and the piano came through the ceiling above them, and the notes fell through the house like proof of something. "He'll be devastated," Clara said. "Yes, and then he'll be all right," she said. Not as a comfort, as a fact stated with the particular authority of a woman who had watched a man come back from somewhere very far away and knew what that return meant about his constitution. "He's not who he was 6 months ago. He can hold this." Edward was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, rougher at the edges, the voice of a man allowing himself to be afraid in front of another person for perhaps the first time in years. "Do you think he knows," he said, "how much I—" He stopped. "I have not been a demonstrative man. I have been present. I have tried to be—" He stopped again. "He knows," Clara said. "He doesn't say it, and neither do you, but it's in every room of this house. He knows." She held Edward's gaze. "Tell him soon. He deserves to hear it from you while you can both still say what needs to be said." Edward nodded. A single steady movement. Above them the piano played on, and somewhere in the notes of it, in the full and living sound of his son at the keys, Edward Beaumont listened. And for the first time in years, listening was not a thing he had to brace himself to do. It was simply a gift he'd been given, and he took it. Clara told him on a Sunday. Not because Sunday was the right day, but because Edward had come down to breakfast that morning and his hands had shaken badly enough that he'd set his coffee cup down and looked at it for a moment, with an expression she recognized a man taking inventory of what his body was telling him and not liking the answer. Nathaniel had been talking about a letter from Philadelphia and hadn't noticed. Clara had noticed. And she'd known sitting there that the time for managing the information carefully was over. She found Nathaniel in the music room that afternoon. He was at the piano bench, not playing, just sitting with a sheaf of notated music he'd been working on original work, something he'd started 2 weeks ago and had been building slowly in the mornings. She came in and sat in the chair across from him and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." He set down the music. He looked at her with the full attention he'd learned to give her. "All right," she told him. All of it what Mrs. Hadley had overheard, what Edward had confirmed in the study, the timeline, the diagnosis, the deliberate concealment. She said it plainly without softening the edges, because she had promised him honesty from the first day, and she was not going to break that promise, because the truth was hard. When she finished, Nathaniel was very still. "How long have you known?" he said. 2 weeks. The stillness deepened. 2 weeks. Yes. And you didn't? He stopped. She watched his jaw tighten, watched him work through it. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" "Because I went to your father first. I told him you were strong enough to hear it, and that he needed to tell you himself." She held his gaze. "I gave him 2 weeks. He kept finding reasons to wait. And today, you ran out of patience. Today, I watched his hands shake and decided that time mattered more than method." She paused. "I'm sorry I didn't come to you sooner. I believed it should come from him. I still believe that. But I should have pushed harder and faster, and I didn't." The silence stretched out. She watched him process it, not with the old withdrawal, not with the shuttered self-protective retreat. He was present in it. Angry, hurt, frightened, and present. "He was protecting me," Nathaniel said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Because he thought I'd use it as a reason to stop." "Yes." He stood up from the piano bench. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she let him have the moment of privacy inside the same room. After a while, he said quietly, "Was he wrong?" She thought about that honestly. 6 months ago, no, he wasn't wrong. Another silence. Then Nathaniel turned around, and his face was the face of a man who had just been handed something very heavy and had decided to carry it rather than put it down. "I need to talk to him," he said. "I know." He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. He put his hand briefly on the side of her head, the way he'd learned to touch her, deliberate and careful, and completely his own. And then he went out of the music room and down the hall. Clara sat in the chair and listened to his footsteps moving toward his father's study. She folded her hands in her lap, and she waited, and the house held its breath around her. The conversation between Nathaniel and his father lasted 2 hours. She knew this because she tracked the time without meaning, to the way you track things when you're sitting with something you can't fix. Mrs. Hadley brought tea to the hallway outside the study, and neither of them came out for it. Polly hovered at the bottom of the stairs with enormous, anxious eyes, until Clara told her quietly to go on, and that things were all right, which was a simplification, but a necessary one. At the 2-hour mark, the study door opened. Nathaniel came out first. He stood in the hallway with his hand still on the door handle, looking at nothing in particular, and Clara came down the stairs and stood in front of him. "Are you all right?" she said. "No," he said, straight out without trying to manage it. "No, I'm not all right. My father is dying, and he kept it from me for months because he thought I was too fragile to handle it, and I—" He stopped. His voice had gone rough at the edges. "I don't know whether to be furious with him or—" He stopped again. "Or—" Clara said gently. "He did it because he loves me," Nathaniel said, and the word came out stripped of all the protective distance he'd once kept around it. "He did the wrong thing entirely for love, and I cannot hold that against him, and I wanted to, and I—" He pressed his free hand against his mouth for a moment, the way people do when they're holding something inside that wants to come out. He told me something. Tell me when you're ready. He looked at her. His eyes were red at the rims. He said he never tried to buy me a wife. He said he tried to buy enough time to see me live again. His voice dropped to something almost inaudible. He said that's all he ever wanted. One more year of watching me live. Clara didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that was bigger than that. Nathaniel made a sound short hard, the sound of a man who has been holding something together with both hands and has just run out of strength to keep holding. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he stood in the hallway with his face against the side of her head and shook once hard, the way people shake when grief that has been compressed finally finds a direction to move. She held him. She did not tell him it would be all right. She did not tell him his father would recover, or that medicine could surprise you, or any of the things that people say to fill the silence around pain. She just held him in the front hallway of Beaumont Estate, with the October afternoon pressing against the windows and the smell of Mrs. Hadley's untouched tea drifting from the hallway table, and she stayed. After a while he straightened. He pulled back just enough to look at her. His face was something she had never seen before on him, fully open, fully present, nothing held in reserve. I don't know how to do this, he said, the same words he'd said in the upstairs hallway weeks ago, but different now. Then they'd meant, I don't know how to let someone in. Now they meant, I don't know how to grieve and keep living at the same time. The same way you've done everything else, she said, one morning at a time. He looked at her for a long moment. Then carefully, like a man making the most considered choice of his life, he said, I love you. I need you to know that before anything else happens. Whatever comes next, I need that to be said and heard. She held his gaze. I know, she said. And then, because this was not a moment for her old deflection, I love you too. I have for a while. I just needed to be sure you were ready to hear it. He exhaled. Something in his whole body settled, not relaxed, not relieved exactly, but settled, anchored. I'm ready, he said. Edward Beaumont did not go quickly. He lasted through November and into the cold of December, and the months were not easy ones, but they were in the way that difficult things sometimes are full. Nathaniel went to his father's study every morning. He sat with him in the evenings. He talked to him the way he hadn't talked to him in years, not about business or estate or the political climate in Richmond, but about real things. Memories. Old arguments that had never been resolved and could now be released without resolution. Things Edward had wanted to say and hadn't, and things Nathaniel had needed to hear and was finally capable of receiving. Clara moved through the house during those months with the quiet steadiness of someone who understands that their role is not to be at the center of a thing, but to hold the edges of it in place. She made sure Nathaniel ate. She made sure he slept. When he needed to talk, she listened. When he needed silence, she provided it. When he sat by his father's bedside for 4 hours without moving, she brought coffee and put it on the table and left without a word. Edward noticed. Of course he noticed. Edward Beaumont had spent 40 years noticing everything. On a Tuesday evening in late November, when Nathaniel had gone to get more wood for the fire and left Clara alone with his father for a few minutes, Edward looked at her from his chair and said, I made a good choice. She looked up from her book. You made a desperate choice, she said. It happened to be the right one. Same thing sometimes. He studied her face. You are not what I expected when I read your letter. What did you expect? Someone simpler, he said. Someone who needed what we were offering badly enough to be manageable. He paused. You are not manageable. I did warn you. You did. Something moved across his face. Warm, rueful, the expression of a man looking back on a decision and finding it entirely right. He's himself again. You understand what I mean by that. Not just, well, not just improved. Himself. The person he was before, but better. Because he knows now what he could lose. His eyes held hers. That's your doing. It's his doing. Clara said. I just didn't leave. Edward made a small sound. That, he said, was everything. When Nathaniel came back, Edward was quiet for a while, and then he said, Nathaniel, come sit down. And he talked to his son for a long time, unhurried, thorough, the way a man talks when he's making sure nothing important is left unsaid. Clara stayed. They didn't ask her to leave. She was by then as much a part of the house as the walls. Edward Beaumont died on a clear, cold morning in December in his own bed with Nathaniel beside him. Nathaniel came out of his father's room and closed the door behind him and stood in the hallway. And Clara was there. She had been there all night in the chair at the end of the hall because she knew. He looked at her, and his face was a thing that could not be described, and she did not try to find words for it. She stood up and went to him, and he put his arms around her and pressed his face into her hair, and she felt him breathe one long, slow breath, the kind that carries everything in it, and she held him through it. He wept. Quietly, privately, the way a man weeps when he has finally learned that grief is not weakness, but weight, and that weight can be carried more easily when someone stands beside you. She held him until he was still, and then a while longer, because there was nowhere else she needed to be. After a time, he lifted his head. He looked at her with red eyes and a steady jaw and said, He's gone. I know. I was with him. He wasn't alone. I know, she said. That mattered. That was the thing that mattered most. He nodded. He straightened. He looked down the hall at the closed door and then back at her, and he said with a simplicity that carried the weight of everything they'd been through from that first doorway conversation to this moment. Stay with me today. Yes, she said. I'll stay. They buried Edward Beaumont on a Friday, and half of Hargrove County came. George arrived the evening before, subdued for once, without his traveling companion and without his easy social gloss. He stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands and said nothing inappropriate, which was perhaps the most generous tribute he could have offered. Aldridge came and brought his wife and stood at the back of the churchyard with his hat pressed to his chest. Dr. Harmon came. The county's businessmen came. People who had not seen Edward Beaumont in years came because he had been a presence in that county for 4 decades, and his absence would leave a shape that the community would feel for a long time. Nathaniel stood through all of it with a stillness that was not the old withdrawal, not the locked-down absence that had been his armor for 3 years. This was the stillness of a man who is fully present inside something painful, and is choosing to remain so. Clara stood beside him, and when the service was over and the condolences came in, she stayed at his side and let him receive them without interference. And when he needed her hand, she was there, and when he didn't, she simply stood near. George found her briefly at the edge of the churchyard. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble, which surprised her. For what I said at dinner, months ago, the implications. He paused. I was wrong about you. She looked at him. You were making an assessment with incomplete information, she said. Most people do. It was unkind. Yes, it was. She paused. Apology accepted, Mr. Beaumont. He nodded. Looked over her shoulder at Nathaniel talking to Aldridge, upright and present and alive. He looks... George stopped. He looks like himself. I'd forgotten what that looked like. I know, Clara said. It's worth remembering. January came and the house was different. Not smaller, grief didn't make the house smaller, but quieter in a different way. The way that spaces become quiet when the particular personality that filled them is gone. Edward's study stood empty for 2 weeks before Nathaniel went in and sat at his father's desk and opened the correspondence that had been accumulating and began methodically to respond to it. Clara heard him in there at odd hours, early mornings, late evenings, and sometimes she brought coffee and left it without entering, and sometimes he called her in and she sat across from him at the desk her husband had first made her sign a contract on, and they talked about what needed doing. He was competent. More than competent. He had, it turned out, the same instincts for land and business that his father had, and they'd lain dormant for 3 years, and were now awake again. He wrote letters. He made decisions. He walked the property with Thomas the stable boy, who had grown several inches over the past months and was rapidly becoming indispensable, and assessed what needed tending in spring. He played piano in the evenings without exception. And one evening in late January, Clara sat in the music room listening to him finish a piece she'd come to love, one of his own compositions, something he'd been refining for 2 months. And when he finished and the last note faded, he turned on the bench and looked at her and said, "You stayed long enough for me to remember myself." She looked at him. "That is what you did," he said. "I want to say it clearly, not as a thank you, though it is, as a fact about what happened." He held her gaze. "I had forgotten who I was. Not because of the illness. I think I'd started forgetting before that, and the illness gave me an excuse to finish the job. And you stayed, and you were honest, and you didn't perform anything or manage anything. You just—" He stopped. "You just stayed. And somewhere in the staying I remembered." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "William would have liked you." He was quiet for a beat. "Tell me about him. The real him. Not the version that's connected to grief." So she did. She told him about a boy who had been small for his age and had grown into it slowly, who had loved horses and hated mathematics and had a gift for making people laugh that he was embarrassed by, who had wanted to study medicine and had been afraid to say so, who had made terrible puns at breakfast and been completely unrepentant, who had been in the full version of him before the graying out, one of the most alive people she had ever known. Nathaniel listened. All of it, the way he always listened. When she was done, he said, "He was lucky to have you. Whatever happened at the end, he had you before it. That's not nothing, Clara. That's considerable." She pressed her lips together, looked at her hands. "It took me a long time to believe that," she said. "I know." He came off the bench and sat beside her in the chair nearest hers and took her hand. "I know it did. And for what it's worth, from the view on this side, you did not fail him. You failed to read the future. That's a different thing." She looked at him. "When did you become wise?" she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "Somewhere between the bad biscuits and the thunderstorm, I think," he said. "It came on gradually." She laughed. Even through the tears that had appeared without her permission, she laughed, and he held her hand through it, and let her feel both things at once, without trying to resolve them into something tidier. That was love, she thought. That was what it actually was, not the resolution of difficult things, but the company inside them. Spring came back to Beaumont Estate, and with it came the roses. The gardens had been neglected for 3 years, not ruined, but untended, grown in directions nobody had planned. In March, Nathaniel went out with Thomas and spent 2 mornings assessing what could be saved and what needed replacing. And then he came to Clara and said, "I want to restore it. The East Garden, all of it. The way it was when my mother was alive." Clara said, "Tell me what it looked like." He described it specific, detailed, with the memory of a boy who had grown up watching his mother tend it, and she listened, and then she went with him to the East Garden, and they walked it together while he talked, and by the end of the morning, they had a plan. The roses came back. Not all at once, gardens don't work that way, but steadily by degrees, the way things come back when they've been neglected, but not destroyed. By May, the first blooms had opened, and Nathaniel stood at the garden gate one morning and looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Clara stood beside him. "Your mother would approve," she said. "She would criticize the spacing on the far row," he said, "and then approve." "Sounds right." He looked at the garden and then at her and said, "I want to tell you something." Quiet, deliberate, the way he said things that mattered. "I spent 3 years waiting to die, and somewhere in that waiting, I convinced myself that was all I was capable of, any more waiting. Being waited for. Existing in the margins of my own life." He paused. "I don't feel that way anymore. I haven't for a while. And I wanted to say it plainly because you deserve to hear things plainly." "You scared me," she said, "when I arrived. Not because I thought you'd die immediately, because I thought you'd already decided to, and I knew how that ended. I know you did. And now," he looked at the roses, looked at her. Now I have things I want to do, he said. Music I want to finish, land I want to manage properly, arguments I want to have about books with someone who argues back. He held her gaze. A family I want to build with you. Children, maybe. A house full of noise after too many years of silence. He said it directly, watching her face. If that's something you want. Yes, she said, simply, without hesitation. That's something I want, he smiled. The full smile, the one that had been absent for so long and had come back slowly, and was now, she understood, just his face, the face of a man who was present in his own life. Good, he said. Then let's begin. Several years passed. They passed the way. Good years pass, not without difficulty, not without grief, returning in the ways that grief always returns when you've loved and lost, but with the steady accumulation of a life that is genuinely being lived. The estate recovered under Nathaniel's hand. The east garden was restored and then expanded. The house, which had been holding its breath for 3 years, exhaled and went on exhaling, filling itself with the noise that Nathaniel had wanted: voices, footsteps, arguments, laughter, the sound of a household that was alive. Thomas became the estate manager and proved to have a gift for it that surprised everyone except Clara, who had suspected it for 2 years. Mrs. Hadley taught her kitchen recipes to a young woman from town, reluctantly at first, and then with evident pride. Polly grew up and married a schoolteacher from Hargrove, and came back to visit on Sundays, sometimes older and settled, and still with the same quick eyes. The music room was never locked again. On an evening in the spring of 1824, Clara sat in the doorway of the music room and watched her husband teach their daughter to play. The girl was 4. She sat on the piano bench beside Nathaniel, with her small hands placed carefully on the keys, completely serious in the way that 4-year-olds are when they've decided something matters. Nathaniel was talking to her the way he'd once talked to Clara, patient, specific, explaining not just the notes, but the relationship between them. The center, the anchor, the way everything else organized itself around what you knew to be true. The girl played a wrong note and looked up at her father with enormous eyes. "Try again," he said. "Easy, unhurried." She tried again, closer. "There," he said. "You hear that?" She nodded, still serious. "That's where it lives," he said. "Remember it." Clara sat in the doorway and watched them, and felt something so complete move through her that she had no useful name for it, except this, that the miracle she had come looking for 3 years before had never been the one she expected. She had come to a locked door in Virginia, with grief in her hands and a promise she intended to keep, and she had found on the other side of that door not a man to be saved, but a man worth staying for. The miracle was not the illness losing its grip, though it had. The miracle was not the estate restored, or the garden blooming, or the house full of sound, though all of that was real. The miracle was that one morning a man who had spent 3 years waiting to die had walked to the window of his own room and opened it, just let the air in, and chosen quietly and without announcement to stay. That was the miracle. And it belonged to him. Nathaniel looked up from the piano and saw her in the doorway, and the look on his face was so ordinary and so entirely his warm present, completely there, that she felt it, the way you feel things you have held for a long time, when you finally let yourself believe they're real. He said nothing. He just held her gaze for a moment, in the particular way of 2 people who have said everything important and no longer need words to say it. Then their daughter played the note again, correctly this time, and Nathaniel turned back to her with a smile, and the music filled the room. And outside the spring light held, and the estate breathed, and inside those walls a man who had once locked his door against the world sat with his child at the piano and gave her note. By careful note, the same thing someone had once given him.